Today I am joined by Dr. Negar Fani. Dr. Fani is a clinical neuropsychologist and an associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral science at one of our local medical schools. And I am super excited to talk to Dr. Fani because I recently read an article that was about her and the work of her and her colleagues. So let me take that back. It wasn't about her, it was about their work. And it came at a time when I was actually thinking about starting this podcast. And what I read in there was so affirming. And I really took as like a sign of like, okay, Whitney, yes, like this shit is legit. Like it's an actual thing. There are scientists, places who are studying this, and they're here and they're affirming you. And so, like, I just want to thank you, Dr. Fani, for not only being on this podcast, that's like a little drop in the bucket, but for all of the work that you and your colleagues are doing.
Oh, it is such a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Yes, of course. So let's start out, if you wouldn't mind, just sharing with us whatever identities that you bring into this space.
Absolutely. So I'll start with the professional. Like you mentioned, I'm an associate professor of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at Emory University, and I'm also an affiliate faculty member in the Emory Neuroscience program, where I serve as the co-chair of admissions and the DEI liaison to the admissions committee, among my other service roles. So that's a little bit about my professional self. Um, my personal self, I'm an Iranian American, and I am a wife and a mom of a almost 9-year-old boy of mixed identity, white and Iranian. And I remind him of that constantly. Don't let him forget about the Iranian part. There's a lot of other things I can say, but I'll let you take the lead.
Yeah, thank you. I like I said, I'm just really excited to have this conversation. I do have a son, and I didn't mention this to you before, who is autistic. And the only reason why I mention that is because that's the only kind of, I don't know, experience or foray into neurosciences and
Mm-hmm,
neuropsychology that I
mm-hmm,
have. So
mm-hmm.
I'm coming at you from a very, very layperson perspective. Um, and I know that that's not necessarily your thing. I'm just saying that's where I'm at.
That's your intersection with psychiatry. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I would love maybe to start us off by talking about how your racial and cultural identities come up in your profession,
Mm-hmm,
how you deal with the intersectionalities of being a woman of color
mm-hmm,
in the science and research field.
mm-hmm. Gosh, that is pretty complicated. So I guess it's pretty easy to say that, being an Iranian American woman, there's not a lot of representation in my field. So representation, not just as an Iranian, but like women of color don't often have leadership positions in psychiatry, in the School of Medicine more generally, and psychiatry specifically is very much dominated by white people and white men more particularly. So it's, you know, when there isn't that much representation, and I don't, like I said, doesn't have to be Iranian women, it could be like any woman of color, it can naturally feel like this is not a place for you, or it's unlikely that you're going to get there. And I guess I've approached this as I approached other things in my life, like getting into grad school, which, the odds of getting into clinical psych grad programs are scarily low. But I sort of paid the most attention to the thing that I wanted the most, which is like, I can see myself being a professor. This is what I want. I want to be a woman scientist and make change in the field. And I take this kind of blinders approach, like this is my goal, and the things around me, the noise is going to be there. Like
Mm.
it's my choice to not pay attention to it and pay attention to my goal. So I try to teach other people who are going through the same struggles, like, the most important thing is to keep and redirect your focus back to your goals and understand that the noise is always going to be there. The clamor of like people saying the odds are not in your favor is always going to be there. And, it's like a car. If you sort of look to your right and your left, not the places where you want to go, you're going to veer in that direction.
Mhm.
So keep your eyes focused on where you want to end up and understand that that noise is going to be there, and that's just part of the journey. It's not anything that you need to pay attention to. Easier said than done. It is really hard. I'm not trying to say that it was easy by any means, but this has been my approach in general.
I love that because especially when I was, like, very young in my career, although, my coworkers would say now too, I'm very much one of those people that I will get sidetracked really easily because there's something happening over here,
Hmm.
um, that I find problematic or whatever, and I want to try and, address that.
Hmm.
Um and sometimes that's fine, sometimes that's good, sometimes that doesn't require a lot of my own personal energy or time
Hmm.
or heartache, but sometimes it does.
Hmm.
And it does very much feel as though I've lost sight of the goal. I think what it comes down to also for me is that I'm learning that I have other passions that are kind of like these tangents of my field.
Hmm.
Um and so maybe what I thought was my goal has changed or
Hmm.
shifted,
Hmm.
which has been just a really interesting realization, but still so difficult to identify sometimes, like when when it's worth
Sure.
the shift, if you will.
Well, it sounds like you're listening to yourself more and more, and that has been hard for me to slow down and listen to myself, because I think that that wasn't something that came naturally because I was too busy trying to assimilate the goals of both my family culture, my bigger culture as an Iranian, and just what is expected of me more generally. And so I wasn't originally going to go into psychology at all. Like, I was going to go into being a physician.
Mm,
So I was pre-med. I was actually at Emory as a undergraduate, as a pre-med student. I took the MCAT and went through the whole thing before I decided to change courses. And that was after some soul searching and realizing, like, oh, this isn't exactly what I want to do. I just haven't been paying attention to my own
mm.
desires. And I think, I mean, that can happen in so many different contexts, but uh, I think part of it was influenced by like being Iranian, and Iranians tend to value careers in medicine or law or engineering
Mm.
a lot more highly than like psychology. And so it wasn't something that came up until I sat down with myself and looked at professions that matched my interests. And it wasn't something that my parents really cared for, but I was like, I'm going to do this anyway.
Yeah, well, I hope they're proud of you though, because I mean, like I said, it's the your research, and we'll get into that in a minute, but your research is just, for me, profound.
Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you. I have to say there is a personal, when you're saying this research isn't what she's going through or something like that, but I was like, yeah, it is. It is. It is, though. Sometimes I wonder when I'm writing about the phenomena that I'm studying, am I talking about other people's experiences or my own, or maybe both?
Yeah,
So I do feel a personal connection with it, certainly.
yeah. So, as part of your psychology research, you have been researching racial trauma
Hmm.
and the effects of racism on our
Hmm.
brains. And
Yeah.
so I'm really interested to hear about what you all have found, but also about like how did you get that
Yeah.
specific? Like why did that come up for you, or how did that come up for you maybe?
Yeah, it came up incidentally. So, about 15 years ago, I started as a graduate student in the Grady Trauma Project. I'm not sure if you've heard of this, study. It's like one of the longest running studies of trauma in the nation.
Mm,
And I was a graduate student who was interested in doing trauma research on attention and attention in the context of emotion. So I wanted to see how trauma affects how we attend to information in social cues like faces or social scenes. Does it cause people to avoid them or pay attention to certain things more than others? How does the emotion that they're experiencing influence their attention or the emotion that they perceive in others? Um, so I started out at this Grady Trauma Project as a graduate student. The project was designed to look at risk and resilience for PTSD in an sort of inner city urban environment of people who have experienced trauma from all different types of ways, not military trauma, but civilian
okay,
trauma.
okay.
And people were recruited and have been recruited historically from Grady Hospital, which is, as you know, situated in downtown Atlanta. It's publicly funded. A lot of the people who come to Grady are economically under resourced, underinsured, and face a lot of other inequities in their lives. A vast majority of people who come to Grady Hospital are Black or Hispanic. And so all of the people coming through Grady Trauma Project that I have studied are Black Americans and mostly women. And so I
Wow.
think that's the study that you're referencing is Black women. That's been, I mean, I would say like 90% of the population that I've been studying over the past 15 years are Black women who have been experiencing all different kinds of trauma. And some of them have symptoms of problems like post traumatic stress disorder, depression, or other types of problems. But many people don't have any disorders at all and are, functioning very well in their lives. Many people do have PTSD and continue to function well in some aspects of their lives, but not others. So there's a lot of diversity in the people that we've studied over the years. So I started out at this Grady Trauma Project wanting to do my master's thesis with a task that measures attentional biases. So it's a task that presents pairs of faces, and one of the faces is a neutral face, and the other has an emotion on it. And it could be like an angry expression or a happy expression or another neutral expression. And we look to see through button press responses what side of the screen the person is looking at, and if they're more vigilant to the threat or more vigilant to another type of emotion. And looking at this as a way to see, is this maybe correlating with different types of problems people are experiencing, like post traumatic stress disorder?
Mhm.
And so I initially presented a task that was given to me that was like all white faces in there. And when we looked at white faces, the patterns were different than when we introduced black faces into the paradigm. And what I noticed was that people who were experiencing more PTSD symptoms showed a vigilance towards threat in the white faces, but not in the black faces. So they were more attentive to threat when it was represented in a white face.
Okay, okay. So is that otherwise other in other words saying they're more threatened by white people? Or
Yes.
they feel the
Yes,
threat more by white
absolutely.
or I
So the
guess white
threat is a
faces,
lot
but
more potent
mhm.
in those people who have PTSD symptoms. And
Mm,
this was like a very striking finding, like this real intersection of the stimulus race with the valence of emotion in people with and without PTSD. And this was like a really striking finding, and he really spoke to something related to racism, right? So
yeah.
for my master's thesis, I did look at the intersection of self-reported experiences of racism with this behavioral phenomenon. But when it came to trying to publish that, that was not really well received in the field. So, um, having done research in a predominantly Black population of people who've experienced trauma, I've gotten to see how differently people have received that research over time. I mean,
Mm,
only in the past couple years have I not received the criticisms that I used to experience, which was you're studying a very homogenous and small group of people, your results won't generalize. And, when you get these criticisms, the big journals are going to say, like, oh, well, this isn't impactful enough. We're not going to publish this. So it was only since 2020, George Floyd, this racial reckoning that suddenly my field has become more receptive to the effects of racism in and of itself, but it's been harder much earlier than that.
And so are you talking about the peer review process?
Yes.
Because when so again, very limited experience
Yes.
with like scientific research period, but
Mhm.
what I'm learning and what people are saying, I mean scientists,
Mhm.
um, sometimes there's not always like science behind some of the studies,
Mhm.
like provable,
Good
we're gonna
science.
do right,
Mhm.
right, we're gonna do this experiment, and no matter
Mhm.
how many times we do it, the results will be the same. And so it
Right.
sounds like what I'm hearing you say, and you just correct me if I'm wrong, is that some of the pushback was that people didn't think essentially that your research was scientific enough.
Absolutely. Yeah. So it didn't fit their way of thinking about the world. I
Mhm,
think there's some for most folks, who are not in the scientific field, I feel like there is an understanding that scientists, like what's out there is relatively unbiased because science has a system to check itself, right? I'm sure as a lawyer, you see a lot of that perspective as well. Like the legal system, it is a balanced system, it has its own checks and balances, and it's all built in there. And once you become a part of that world, you understand how flawed that way of thinking is and how biases can manifest in all sorts of ways that you had no idea could exist. And many times, if you have like a partner or a spouse who is not in the field too, and they hear these stories, they're like, "What is going? Like, how? What in the world? Like,
yeah,
should I be questioning what I'm reading?" And I'm always like, "Yeah, you should dig into the literature." And the problem is, the biases are often manifest not necessarily only in what you see, but what you don't see, what is not published. And so, what I was mentioning is like how hard it was to get these data out there about attentional biases in PTSD that were race specific. And the truth of the matter is that when I published this study, there was no mention of race in the title, and it was not highlighted in the introduction or the discussion because it was not publishable in that sense. Like I could not say that, yeah, there's something related to race here and racism specifically, because it wouldn't have gotten published. Like it was not well received. So I really had to tone down any notions of like this bias is related to people experiencing discrimination at the hands of white people, and that's probably why they're more vigilant to threaten white faces and not black faces,
yeah,
um, because that just wasn't well received. And I have to say, like, it's not necessarily well received now, but there's a lot more receptivity to it
mhm.
post George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. People are being forced to pay attention to it now in a way they didn't before, but that doesn't mean that they're internally hearing it and wanting to hear it.
Yeah, and that like this process just the first thing that I think about is this concept of gaslighting, this idea that like I'm experiencing something and people around me are telling me that I'm not experiencing it.
Hmm.
And then I start to question myself. And that's something that like I as a black woman experience a lot, particularly when it concerns racial harms. And so I'm hearing you describe this on a more like systematic level relating to the research and the fact that you had findings,
Hmm.
but are then being told, that they're not good enough, essentially, is
Hmm.
what or, they're not maybe scientific enough. I don't know what words they use, but
Hmm.
it's a very interesting like that tool of supremacy or
Hmm.
of perpetuating certain cultural values can be used in a variety of different like, it can be used interpersonally, but it
Hmm.
can also be used systematically, and
Hmm.
structurally.
Hmm. Yeah, I think that the invisibility of racism is one of the most powerful ways that it, messes up people's lives.
Mhm,
Is just how invisible. it is and leads people to question themselves rather than question the systems or the people that they're working with. It's insidious and it needs to be called out. And my hope is that with this research that we can just name the problem and show it for what it is and hope that there will be some policy change like resulting from it ultimately.
Yeah. So I'd love to have you maybe explain what the findings were.
Sure.
And I recall reading specifically about the brain, and that was what was so
Mhm.
validating for me, is this idea that when I'm experiencing racial trauma, it's having, like, an effect on my body, like, not just
Mhm.
on, like, I'm sad or I'm mad or angry or
Mhm.
whatever, but, like, I'm having a physiological response.
Mhm.
And so I would love to hear about what you all found.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is the functional neuroimaging study in JAMA psychiatry that I think you're referencing, and um, it's part of kind of a body of work that isn't just about how it affects brain function, but how it can affect brain structure too. I'm happy to like go into as much depth as you want me to for the rest of the work, but so I think I mentioned I'm interested in attention, and so what happened with this study is the participants were Grady Trauma Project participants who were all women, who were Black women, a wide age range, 18 to 65 years old. And they were presented with a different attention task while they were getting scanned. And this attention task involved um, doing a neutral attention task, so counting the number of numbers you see on a screen while being presented with distracting information that sort of flashes here and there. And so your goal is to like do a thing that just involves like a neutral attention task, but ignore the distracting information. And the distracting information could be threat related, it could be positive, or it could be neutral. And the threat related images were images that were designed to reflect people's trauma experiences like domestic violence or gun violence. So it's we
Was it like
selected
I'm sorry, was it that specific person's trauma?
no,
Okay.
no, they
Whew,
were
thank
more
God.
general.
Oh my gosh, that
Yeah,
would have been awful.
yeah. So yeah, I mean, it can sound like we'd really torture people, but the point of it is to see what happens when people are dealing with trauma memories or reminded of these painful experiences. What happens in the brain? Um, and so this isn't just something I use like in a cross sectional way. I do intervention research, and I use this task to see how brain function changes as a result of going through an intervention. Um, so we presented this task and also asked people to report on experiences of racial discrimination using a very widely used, well validated measure called the Experiences of Discrimination Scale. And this scale asks people to identify the different ways in which they experience discrimination as it relates to race, ethnicity, or skin color across different settings, whether it be like school, work, law enforcement, medical settings, you name it. So just count the number of different types of experiences that you've had over the lifetime. And we looked at frequency of racial discrimination experiences and correlated it with brain response as people are doing the task. And we wanted to really focus on the threat related conditions because we know that threat can really disrupt attention in PTSD. And I wanted to look at racial discrimination related trauma here. So, what we found was that people who had experienced more racial discrimination as they were being presented with these trauma cues in this attention task, they showed an increased activation in areas of the brain that are involved with vigilance for threat. So, the areas of the brain that are primarily involved with processing incoming attentional information. So, just vigilance, and an area of the brain that's involved with regulating emotions. So this is an area of the brain called the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and it's an area of the brain that is highly interconnected with the amygdala, which I'm sure many of you have heard of. It's our brain's primary emotion processing center. So it receives incoming information, detects if that information is salient, including threat related information, and sends signals to other parts of the brain. And the ventromedial prefrontal cortex sort of acts as a brake to the amygdala. And what was really interesting was that we found an increased response in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, that area that's like the brake for the amygdala, in people who've had more racial discrimination experiences. So this could tell a very interesting story. It could mean that people are having to regulate their emotions more as they're receiving these threat relevant images. Um, and this is an interesting notion because PTSD has generally been characterized by a deficiency in ventromedial prefrontal cortical response. So it's like PTSD has been generally characterized as like a breaks off, amygdala on kind of thing. But here we see the racial discrimination works very differently. It sort of increases engagement in these emotion regulatory regions, and that could be as a function of people having to regulate their emotions to get through threat. So it's like having to work twice as hard to get just as far as anyone else.
Mhm.
It's like your brain is having to work hard to regulate emotions, and that could mean not, responding in an aggressive way when someone, comes at you in a hostile fashion. It could also mean this idea that we were talking about earlier that, you know, the person is feeling like, is this me? Trying to regulate your emotions, questioning yourself, that kind of a process that could be elevated in people who've experienced more racial discrimination. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so and I'm a couple of examples came to or not examples, but,
Yeah.
maybe similarities of experiences came to mind, and I'm thinking specifically about just this idea that because okay, so what I'm hearing is what you all found was that for people who are experiencing racial discrimination and trauma related to racial discrimination, essentially,
Mhm.
they're working their muscles in the brain, whichever
Mhm.
I don't remember the long
Yeah.
name that you used to describe the prefrontal I don't know.
Yep.
Uh,
The prefrontal cortex,
so
yeah.
they're yeah, so they're using and have maybe built additional muscle in that area of the brain, if you will. Whereas people who are not experiencing those things may not be building that type of muscle and that type of capacity is really what I'm thinking about. And so
Mhm.
like one thing that I recently was talking about with somebody was about how different age groups coped with the various effects of the pandemic and
Mhm.
everything from isolation to loved ones getting sick and dying and all that type of thing. Actually, a guest, Dr. Ruth White, she was talking about that older folks did better during the pandemic in terms of their mental
Mhm.
functioning or capacity, and that the theory is that this is because they've lived through shit, you know?
Mhm. Sure.
Like, they've worked the muscle,
Mhm.
and they've been through some trying times, and they've experienced some things, and I think she said that the people who fared the worst were, like, tweens
Mm.
who were cut off from the social connections that, we
Mhm.
spent so much time during our adolescence and those years engaging and learning through social connection,
Mhm.
and that,
Yeah.
they did the worst, if you will. And so that's really what I'm thinking of when you're talking about this research, and it's something that makes
Mhm.
sense to me. It's like, well, we as folks of color are needing to utilize, this whatever resource we have within us to be able
Mhm.
to regulate ourselves
Mhm.
enough so that when we are faced with racial
Mhm.
discrimination, we essentially aren't making matters worse. You
Right.
know, I mean, that's how I see it, is whenever
Mhm.
I'm experiencing racial discrimination, I'm trying to figure out how to not make this worse.
Yes. Yes. You're onto something. And, maybe using the same, analogy with the muscles, like muscles, you practice something, you build them up, you get them strong, but there's also muscle fatigue and breakdown.
Mm,
So muscles aren't designed to be constantly in use, right? There will be a breakdown in your muscles if you're constantly using them without a break, without
mhm,
rest.
mhm,
And our brains are similar in that way. Our brains aren't designed to constantly be regulating ourselves, like,
mm,
or constantly be vigilant. It takes a lot of resources, and our brains need to have a break. Um, And when you're constantly in a position where you're regulating yourself or you're questioning yourself, that takes a real toll. And that's kind of what our structural studies are showing, that over time, this can wear away at the brain, some of the most vulnerable structures of the brain, including these frontal structures. So, and kind of going back to that study, what you were mentioning about, sometimes when you've experienced more adversity, it does make you more effective in certain situations. What we found was that performance on this attention task was better in people who'd experienced more racial discrimination. So they didn't show any deficits in performance, quite the opposite. Um, but it could come at a higher resource cost. There's a much higher prevalence rate of brain health problems in Black Americans than white Americans. So problems like Alzheimer's disease is twice as prevalent in Black individuals as compared to white. And what I think about, as a brain researcher is like, what are the things that contribute to that disparity? And one thing that can contribute to neurodegeneration, like the wearing away of the brain in an accelerated way, is racial trauma and race related stressors. Um, so our subsequent studies have shown that racial discrimination, although it, like in this context, it's related to better performance on a task, more experiences of racial discrimination over the lifespan are correlated very strongly with degradation of white matter in the brain. And white matter serves as like the highways between different areas of the brain. White matter is critical. And white matter is something that takes a longer time to develop than gray matter. So it's really interesting. And what we've seen is that racial discrimination has effects on white matter throughout the brain, but particularly in those prefrontal areas that I'm mentioning, those regulatory areas of the brain. So it seems to have especially targeted effect in those regulatory areas, and those are areas that are going to be affected by problems like Alzheimer's, dementia, or other types of brain health problems. So it's like showing that this is having a clear, direct pathway to health disparities, vulnerability for these kinds of problems down the road. And it's just something that we don't screen for in the clinic.
Mhm.
As a clinician myself, I know that this is not something that we screen for or target necessarily in treatments, a lot of mental health treatments. So it's, you know, invisible again.
It's fascinating to think about what this type of research can mean for folks of color
Hmm.
who are essentially at risk. We're at higher
Yeah.
risk of things like dementia. It sounds
Hmm.
like it's what it sounds like you're saying to me.
Yeah.
And so, it's interesting to think about like what screening for that looks like. And
Yeah.
then if we're screened for it and we are determined to be at high risk, like
Hmm.
then what? It seems like there's a lot of work being done on the other end of things. Like we've
Hmm.
already determined that there are these risks and
Hmm.
now we're trying to address those situations without necessarily knowing why, like the
Hmm.
root of these
Hmm.
issues, and the work that you're doing, it sounds like, is getting at the root.
I'm hoping that it sheds light on the mechanisms, and this
Mm,
is something that we're digging into more and more, is not just looking at like this one task, but what are these other mechanisms that lead to increased vulnerability to brain health problems? And I'm interested in the mechanisms of like that seem very invisible. So things that are less obvious, like response to threat, like that's a commonly studied thing in post-traumatic stress disorder. But this idea that racism acts in a very invisible way, an insidious way that has to do with people questioning themselves, suppressing their emotions, having to regulate themselves more. This is something that is very unnecessary. It's an unnecessary stressor. It's something that we can get, bring light on and help people understand that it's not you, it's the racism. And this can be a load off because I think the self questioning, it keeps the stressor alive in people's
mm.
mind. And this, it keeps it alive and going and eating away at people. And I am interested in bringing light to this, um, and bring policy change into the dangers of racism eliminating it on an institutional level, like, making it clear that there's no place for this type of interaction and, moving forward, collective healing. We talked initially about like, what are some of the things that help us get through? And I think that podcasts like this can really help like people understand that we as people of color, we do experience these kinds of things, and there is indeed an insidious negative effect that it can have on us. And this isn't to be kind of like all doom and gloom. Like the story that I want to
Yeah.
tell is not one of like, we're all destined to have Alzheimer's or something like that. But it's to say that this is real. What's happening is real. And what we can provide to each other, the support that we can provide in validating each other's experiences, supporting each other is real, and I think can help fight against these insidious effects.
Yeah, absolutely. I was going to ask you about
Hmm.
like, so how do we counteract this? And what I heard you say is validate each other, support each other, know that what we're experiencing is real.
Right.
As I like to say, resist the racial gaslighting, like it's
Hmm.
real. I'll say for myself, I'm looking for healing from this
Hmm.
because it is exhausting. You were talking about that our brains and these functions of our brains aren't meant to just be going nonstop, and
Hmm.
I think for somebody who, is not a person of color or who has not experienced this type of, racial discrimination on such a consistent and continuous basis, I think about, like, when we're going through an emotional difficulty, like, maybe it's caring for an aging parent who is,
Hmm.
like, on their deathbed, or
Hmm.
there is some kind of acute trauma accident that happened, and now we're needing to be in the ER with our loved one to support them for
Hmm.
37 hours, and
Hmm.
just how exhausting that those type of emotional situations are, and that's at times what it feels like when I'll speak for myself only, when I am experiencing a racially toxic environment and where I feel as though it's difficult for me to just breathe in my skin because of, like, what's happening outside
Hmm.
of me, and if I have to stay in that environment for hours or days, then when I'm
Hmm.
able to leave that environment, it does feel like I have to sleep. Like, I have to sleep for, like,
Hmm.
a day and a half
Yeah.
now because I just need to rest,
Hmm.
and, like, recharge a little bit
Hmm.
from all of that emotional energy that was spent just trying to cope with the situation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you're regulating. Like, I think a big part of what people face is dealing with like unacceptable interactions and then regulating and modulating the response so that they can be the most effective and get through it successfully without causing some sort of breakdown in the relationship or their job, whatever it is, like not saying what you feel, like which may be very strong, but saying the thing that you think that other person wants to hear so that you can get through and get past it and move on to the next thing. That's exhausting, it's depleting, and I think that's the thing that we're
Absolutely.
talking about. And these are things that can be named, and this on an institutional level, like when we really name microaggressions and tell people like this is what a microaggression looks like. This is what you should not be doing. I think that if institutions took this seriously and enacted some repercussions for people acting in this way, then things would look very different than they do now. But the fact is, when we have so many trainings related to microaggressions or microinterventions, number one, they're optional. Like I can say in my institution, they're all optional for the most part, and when someone, perpetuates it, there's no real consequences. So how
At
different
all.
would it be if these were mandatory trainings and there were consequences? Similar to like consequences of sexual harassment. And I'm not saying that there is real justice with that either, but I can say that there's a lot more movement than there is for racial discrimination. So,
Right, right, yes. How can we begin to hold each other accountable for perpetuating these harms.
Right.
And I had a conversation earlier today about, like, compassion, and, because when I say this, I don't mean it in a negative or a punishment way.
Mhm.
I just mean, how can we get to a place where if there is a racial harm perpetuated, then we can have a conversation about
Yeah,
why that was a harm,
sure.
and with, like, the people who are involved not making it worse, like,
Mhm.
again, how do I get out of the situation without making it worse?
Right.
You
Right.
know?
Right.
So,
Mhm.
well, I appreciate your time so much, Dr. Fani.
It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure, and I see your podcast as, like, a great way for people to feel that validation and have a safe space, hearing other people's stories. Hopefully, it's a load off for them to understand that it's not you. It's the
Yes,
racism.
yes. And I plan on, linking the Washington Post article in the show notes. If folks are interested in learning more about your work and what you're
Yeah.
studying, where can they find that information?
They can, go to my website, negarfani.com, and, there's a lot about the different programs of research that we have there, and all of our publications are available online. You can go there and click, and if you're interested in joining a study in your local, you might be eligible. Take a look and join.
Yeah, although so I did see when I was researching you, I saw the
Mhm.
studies and there was one study that I wanted to sign up for, but then we had this conversation and I was thinking about how I asked if, like, you were showing people pictures of their own trauma or, like, of their and I was like,
Oh,
"Ooh, I don't know if I would."
oh, yeah, we don't have
But that's
that.
not
We
what
don't.
it is.
No,
That's not what
no,
it is.
we don't, we don't. But yeah, we do have some images that might be evocative for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for joining us, and I look
Thank you.
forward to, learning more from you and continuing to watch this research develop.
Likewise. Thank you for inviting me. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this episode. It is really powerful for me to be able to put science behind what I'm feeling. And that's why when I read the Washington Post article about the research that Dr. Fani and others are doing, I felt as though I needed to dig into that. So if you got lost along the way, no problem. What it comes down to is racial trauma that we experience as people of color has an actual impact on our brains. It has an impact on the way that we are able to manage the information. And if you're particularly a Black person, it makes it so that we are able to multitask with that negative impact that's happening in a way that white people or people who are not experiencing racial discrimination at the rate that we're experiencing it as our essentially our brain muscles have adapted. And I just think that that's so important because oftentimes, as you heard us discuss, we are in situations where we're saying that we are experiencing something and we are not believed. And that causes a range of emotional reactions, but it also is impacting our brain. So I hope this was as interesting for you as it was for me. I did catch up with Dr. Fani post recording, and she shared that there is a mindfulness clinical trial that's happening in her lab right now. So if you are interested and you're local, so if you're in Atlanta or the Georgia area and are interested in participating in that or any of the other studies that the Fani Lab is doing, please go to her website at www.negarfani.com. That's NEGARFANI.com. All right, y'all. Be validated. Until next time. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. If you liked what you heard, don't forget to listen to past episodes and to subscribe. Also, feel free to leave me a message. I want to know what you think about this show. So you can do that by leaving a review, or you can do that by sending me an email at imposterixpodcast@gmail.com. This podcast is for me, and this podcast is for you. And I hope that you're leaving this podcast and this experience feeling validated because that's the goal. Be validated. Until next time.